Hi, it's Tom here. I'm not actually on the podcast this week, but regardless, I wanted to take a moment to record this to say a huge thank you to everyone who supports Spiked and to let you know about how you can support us if you don't already. The answer is there's loads of ways to do it. The best way, as many of you will know by now, is through a monthly donation by going to spiked-online.com and hitting the big red donate button. Even £5 a month makes a huge difference to us. It helps us plan for the future. One-off donations, however, are also greatly appreciated if you can't commit to anything regular right now. And if you can't make a donation at the moment, there are other ways that you can show your support. You can give this podcast and all of our other podcasts a glowing rating and review with your provider. It's a great way for us to reach new people. If you're watching or listening to this on YouTube, you can hit the like button and the subscribe button if you have a YouTube account. And just as crucially, you can share our work. Tell your friends, post it on social media. Any way you can spread the word is still greatly appreciated. So thanks so much for all your support. Now, on with this week's show.
Hello and welcome to the Spiked podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and with me this week we have Spiked columnist Ella Whelan.
Hi.
And Tom Slater is away, so Spiked columnist Tim Black is joining us down the line.
Hi.
Coming up on the show, Caroline Flack, Andrew Sabisky, and Dave at the Brit Awards.
The TV presenter of Love Island, Caroline Flack, has died.
In the wake of Caroline's death, close friends and the media have raised questions about how much press intrusion played a part.
To the press, the newspapers who create clickbait, who demonise and tear down success. We've had enough.
We all need to think about what we can do to change the environment.
Love Island presenter Caroline Flack died by suicide on Saturday. In an unpublished Instagram post released by her family, she said her whole world had been swept away from under her feet. At the end of last year, Flack was charged with assaulting her boyfriend Lewis Burton. Flack denied the offence and Burton refused to support the prosecution. Nevertheless, Flack was still dropped by ITV. Commentators have been quick to point the finger at the press, particularly the tabloids. A petition calling for tighter laws on how newspapers cover celebrities has gained over 600,000 signatures. Ella, that's not the full picture, is it?
No, and I genuinely think lots of people were really shocked by this, partly because by court order in some respects, Caroline Flack had been forced out of public life. She wasn't posting particularly on social media. She's usually always in the headlines. She wasn't, other than nasty coverage of unflattering and upsetting pictures of her going to court and all these kinds of things. So the news that she'd taken her own life was genuinely shocking. But the worst thing that was literally in the minutes and hours after her death was announced, there was this huge row ensuing on social media about who was to blame. And usually when these things happen, you have a general sensible sense from most people of, the person isn't even cold yet. I mean, this is really distasteful to be rowing over what killed them. But in this case, there was people immediately slamming The Sun, for example, for running, its history of running particularly unpleasant and intrusive stories about Caroline Flack's past and her love life and her social life, and whether it was blaming the tabloids, there was others who then said, pointed the finger at ITV and said that they had failed her when they'd essentially cut ties with her or forced her out after the allegations were made against her with the abuse scandal with her boyfriend. But really the overarching picture is we don't know why she took her own life. The releasing of that Instagram post by her family was quite important because actually it was a reminder to everyone that, the different mental states that a person can have when they are that unwell and that unstable, because in that post she sounded like she's very determined to clear her name, to get her life back together. And then obviously that wasn't the case come February. The thing we have to take away from this is that there is this very confused picture, in my point of view, about celebrity culture and that whole world, and especially the relationship with the media and social media. Because the uncomfortable truth is an individual like Caroline Flack, a celebrity, courted media attention, was extremely proud of the show she was the presenter of, Love Island, really enjoyed that lifestyle, went on salacious dates with 17-year-olds at one point and, really courted media attention, good and bad. So the idea that it was media focus that killed her is just not true. The truth is it's probably a mix of things. Going forward, there's been calls for Caroline's Law to silence what kind of press coverage there can be. There's calls for Love Island to shut down. I think that the most sensible approach is to just let this woman rest in peace and not take any kind of moral lessons from the death of Caroline Flack.
Yeah, I think that was really the most striking thing. You know, the hashtag the scum was trending to point the finger at the Sun. One mental health campaigner said she had effectively been killed by manslaughter by the press. A Labour MP called the Sun a despicable rag which continues to spread a daily message of vindictiveness and hate in its pages. The Guardian said the Sun was feeding vicious online abuse of a clearly vulnerable woman. And, you know, obviously the Sun does a lot of celebrity coverage, but actually when it came to, you know, some of the allegations, they did run some defences of Flack. And at a time when, you know, her employer ITV had not defended her. I think that was one of the striking aspects of this. Of course, I don't want to impute any motive into the suicide, but it was interesting that ITV didn't defend her. And in recent times, you know, we talked about on the podcast recently about Alistair Stewart. It failed to defend, you know, one of its veteran broadcasters against allegations that he'd been basically tweeting the wrong thing. So one kind of problem, I guess, in the current era could be that there is a kind of institutional cowardice, that there is an unwillingness for institutions like ITV or maybe the BBC and other places to stand up for their own people when they get allegations thrown at them. And, you know, that's in no way to blame ITV for this suicide, because it's, as you said, there's always a multitude of factors. But I thought that was one of the striking things. Tim, what are your thoughts?
It was absolutely striking, the speed with which people used Caroline Flack's death to vent their prejudices and their agendas as well. And obviously the principal one was that a chance to bash the tabloids and of course the people that read them, the public that lap it up. You know, you even had Keir Starmer having a go at the tabloids over Caroline Flack's death, and then talking about the possibility under a Labour government of you know, forcefully diversifying, as he put it, the press. And it's bizarre in a way, because you know that people like Keir Starmer and the countless others who've been venting their spleen over the last few days do not read The Sun and certainly do not watch Love Island. Or you know, perhaps Keir Starmer does. Perhaps I've got him all wrong. Perhaps he's at home every night tuning in to see the shenanigans of a bunch of buxom young lovelies, but I doubt it. I doubt it very much. Caroline Flack herself, actually, in the aftermath of the death of one of the Love Island contestants last year, the suicide of Mike Thalasitis, she actually said, or had a go at those who were quick to blame Love Island for its failure to look after its contestants. She said that when something this horrible and sad occurs, it's so dangerous to point fingers within hours and minutes of it happening. And it seemed that just so many were willing to, you know, ignore that type of advice and get stuck in. You mentioned the Caroline's Law hashtag. I think that equally, or perhaps even worse, was the hashtag Be Kind, which has an entirely coercive function, I think, because you're effectively saying to people, to journalists, you know, hold off on criticising people in the public eye, hold off on reporting things because it could be considered to be mean or have certain, unforeseen consequences. And so not only is that coercive, but it's also hypocritical, because the same people who are, hashtagging Be Kind, they're the same ones saying, calling other people scum, thick, idiotic. So it's effectively saying be kind to people who are a bit like us, but don't be kind to those people over there. So it's both coercive and hypocritical. The whole thing also is just desperately sad as well. I
think also when people were kind of pointing the blame at the media, social media, the whole thing that was overlooked was the allegations against her and the weight that allegations against you, they can have on a person. It's a very serious and testing thing for any person to be arrested and charged by the police and to face trial. Now, obviously, we don't know the truth of those matters. All we know is that she denies it, and that her boyfriend, who was the victim in that circumstance, did not want the process to go ahead. We've seen similar things in the wake of Me Too, where People who've been accused of sexual assault have gone on to kill themselves, thinking about the Welsh Assembly member Carl Sargent, Benny Fredriksson, who is head of the Stockholm Arts Centre, Kultur, who's at Stadsisten. He went on to kill himself. There was the film producer Jill Messick. She was a colleague of Harvey Weinstein and was basically accused by Rose McGowan and others of failing to offer solidarity with abused women. There was a Mexican rock star recently who killed himself after an allegation was made in what he called a radical protestation of innocence. And so there is almost, by blaming only the press and only social media, there is this unwillingness to confront the fact that we live in quite a dangerous culture where, you know, allegations are made and their presumption of innocence is often lost. And, you know, it's very hard for people to deal with that pressure.
Yeah, and in the case of Caroline Flack's, that evening that the row between her and her boyfriend broke out and the consequences of it, people used it as a political moment. So because there's this big mess of a discussion about #MeToo and believe the victim and all of that kind of thing, I mean, most of us who are halfway sensible look at the information that came out of that case with Caroline Flack and probably come to the conclusion that she is not a domestic abuser, but that there was something far more messy and complicated going on that's actually pretty common among couples, and that you have some very dark times. But because there's this whole narrative of you having to commit to believing the victim, the CPS felt, I think, pressured to go through with it, even though Lewis Burton said, he actually, I think at one point said, I'm not a victim, I'm a witness to this. So he really didn't want this to go ahead. They refused her a dispensation to contact him at Christmas and at New Year's. And there was lots of people on social media saying, look, you know, everyone goes on about #MeToo and women, but women can be abusers too. So it was much bigger than actually those two individuals. Yeah. And the weight of that on her must have been immense. And I think that you know, again, without wanting to say this is the reason why Caroline Flack took that horrible final step, you know, I think looking at it, the allegations made against her, the fact that she was not just dragged through the press, but dragged through the press as this abusive monster, this something that was actually completely alien to her own identity. She got blown up into this gigantic symbolic figure. You know, that must have been extremely hard to deal with. And if there is one thing to learn going forward, is that this should increase the belief in, I think that's a lacking, of innocent until proven guilty, because there's nothing worse that you can imagine in terms of your psychological mental health of being blamed for something that you didn't do.
You're listening to the Spiked podcast. Spiked has no subscriptions and no paywalls. All of our content is free. We rely on the generosity of our listeners and readers to keep us going and growing. For those of you who already donate to Spiked, we can't thank you enough. It really means a lot to the team. If you haven't already, then why not consider giving Spiked a donation? You can make a one-off payment or give monthly by going to spiked-online.com. At the beginning of the year, the Prime Minister's chief strategist, Dominic Cummings, posted on his blog that Downing Street was looking to hire misfits and weirdos with odd skills. One of the first weirdos through the door was Andrew Sabisky, a self-styled super forecaster. But he was forced to quit his role after old comments were uncovered. Sobieski had previously said that black Americans had lower IQs than white Americans. He also argued that forced contraception could prevent unplanned pregnancies, which needed to be curbed because they risked creating a permanent underclass. His Reddit account was also uncovered, and comments found him expressing his interest in incest erotica. Tim, there's a lot of talk in right-wing circles that this is an example of offence archaeology or cancel culture, and that we should just defend Sabisky on free speech grounds. I mean, what would be your take on that?
The first thing to say is that, you know, there does seem to have been a catastrophic failure to vet applicants here for senior positions in government. You know, for all the talk of Dominic Cummings' genius, it seems like a rather insensible decision not to check whether Sabisky might have said or published things online which might, unfortunately, confirm the rather tedious narrative of the Tories being a racist Nazi government, or certainly the narrative that some of the left say. You know, because there Cummings is, having seemingly appointed Sabisky, who unfortunately did seem to confirm people's worst prejudices about the Tory government, is an example of cancel culture. Sobieski, he's free to spout nonsense about, the role genes play in IQ and in inherited intelligence and so on. And he can spout that stuff on, countless dark Enlightenment forums in which that kind of sub-Nietzschean rubbish tends to flourish. But the question of whether he should be allowed or appointed to an advisory position in government to be talking to Boris Johnson about policy, that's a completely different question. And it seems entirely right that the government have. We don't actually know whether he resigned or the government pushed him. I suspect he was going to be sacked, and he decided to take the jump. But it seems entirely right that they should have got rid of him.
Yeah, Ella, what are your thoughts?
Well, Brendan wrote a column on this week, and I think the really interesting thing that he pointed out that lots of other people were missing in this kind of discussion online from lots of prominent right-wingers saying, this is a free speech issue, was how, while the views of Sabisky in specifics are quite unique in terms of it's not everybody believes that there's an underclass to be prevented and that black people have different intelligence to white people because of their genetics and all that kind of thing. That's the extreme end. But actually, the point that Brendan made was there's been a broader acceptance of ideas of determinism and this sort of sense that people are fated to be a certain way, and whether that's the social determinism of the left or the, as we see, slightly darker genetic determinism of the right, it's sort of widespread. And I was thinking about things like, David Attenborough, an individual who is, held up as a kind of superhero, superstar by many in the West, has some pretty dark views when it comes to population control, and he holds those views that women in African nations should be educated in order for them to stop having children. And that's not quite a eugenicist clamp down on forced sterilization of pregnancies, but it's on the same journey towards where people got those kind of ideas from. In all discussions, even on a lighter end, of quotas for women in positions or quotas for working class or disadvantaged kids in universities, there's this general sense that people who are born a certain way, a certain thing, a certain identity, will end up living their life a certain way. Yeah. And it's the same trend that comes from the idea that you are going to have a lower IQ if you're born in Tottenham to a single parent family, that if you're born in Tottenham to a single parent family, you're going to need a hand up or a leg up to get into Cambridge. So actually, what we should take from the Sabisky scandal is not that the Tories are full of eugenicists, but actually that we've become worryingly and increasingly okay with a sense of determinism being a good explanation for the way people are.
And the kind of flourishing of kind of genetic ideas is just one expression of that. I think also what is really striking is that it has now become normal for people at the top of society to consider themselves so much better than working class people, that, they're so much more enlightened and more deserving of the vote and things like that, that whether they explain that on the grounds that, I have a degree and they don't, or I have better genes than they don't, often the result ends up being the same. I think there is a worrying rise of, some quite strange ideas about genetics happening on the right. And it was interesting that Dominic Cummings himself has dabbled in these ideas. He produced this, 200-page document for the Department for Education when he was working with Michael Gove, basically making the argument that genes play a greater role in people's educational performance than their teachers. And, there's a part of me that thinks that if you really believe that, then what is the point of the Department of Education? What is the point of having an education if actually these things are written not so much in the stars, but in your DNA? I think it is completely nonsense. I think there's, it takes absolutely no account of social forces, our relationships with society. The fact is that you could put people with the same DNA in two different parts of the world, and because of the class they're born into, the nature of the way society is set up, how the economy is going, where they live in those countries, geography, all those things are going to have a much bigger impact than on whether they have a certain set of genetic characteristics. It seems to me to be completely crazy. I think people are going on a kind of fool's errand trying to work out this stuff. I just want to say one thing quickly on Dominic Cummings' kind of misfits and weirdos. It's funny how actually, voters kind of take back control from the EU technocracy, but Dominic Cummings has his own kind of vision for technocracy where the people like Sabisky, who call themselves super forecasters, are going to disrupt the civil service. And it's quite a romantic kind of vision, and I'm not sure that it's actually going to get very far. The right policies will be determined by whether they work on the ground, not by whether some wonk has some special way of thinking about it. Tim, do you want to add anything?
It has revealed something perhaps we already knew, that, for all the rather excited press that comes Dominic Cummings' way, I think it's highly problematic that he tends to think, and I suspect perhaps some members of the Conservative leadership seem to think, that the political crisis and opportunity of the past 3 years, or the crisis that it's revealed itself, appears to them as something that can be solved either bureaucratically or technocratically. And in some ways they're sort of the same thing. And it does tell us, it does reveal something, I think, about the nature of the current Conservative administration. The other aspect of this whole fiasco in some ways, you're both right about this kind of how the determinism that we're seeing here on this kind of right-wing determinism, that everything can be reduced to genes or biology and so on, does in a sense mirror the cultural determinism of many on the, I guess we'd sort of call it the liberal left. There is that. There's also the way in which this idea that there, Sabisky does seem to sort of articulate these ideas that racial inequality is in some way the product of a genetic or biological inequality, and therefore there's not too much you can do about it. That almost seems to be a mirror image, if you like, of that attempt to, on the part of the liberal left, to divide society up into these kind of cultural ethnic blocks. And what it seems to do is, what this kind of Sabisky view seems to do is, it seems to almost respond to the almost like hierarchy of victimhood which the liberal left establishes. It seems to respond to it by sort of reasserting, or as you say, repackaging these kind of horrible old ideas. It seems to respond to this kind of hierarchy of victimhood with this, old-fashioned hierarchy of race grounded upon this supposed sort of natural inferiority of non-white peoples. So I think what both sides in this kind of battle of the determinisms seem to leave no room for is that space for autonomy, that space for an individual to, they allow no sort of concept that an individual can think and judge and act freely and can develop oneself, can transcend whatever determinants in their genes or their backgrounds there happen to be.
You're listening to the Spiked podcast. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and more. And if your provider allows you to, why not give us a rating and a review while you're there? It really helps new listeners find the show. The rapper Dave performed at the Brit Awards this week and added an extra verse to his hit song Black. In it, he accused the Prime Minister of being a real racist, attacked the press coverage of Meghan Markle, and criticised deforestation, among other things. Dave's extra verse was praised by Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, Baroness Saida Varsi, practically every Guardian journalist, and more. Ella, what did you make of it?
Well, I mean, it's actually an interesting thing to look at because, the idea of putting politics or protest into a song is long-standing. And I was thinking about, Ghost Town by the Specials, Police on My Back, The Clash, Strange Fruit by Nina Simone. There's been moments at times in history in which people who are predominantly musicians and artists have used their platform to make political points. And so Dave is not doing anything new in that.
Yeah.
But the difficult thing is he just threw so much in there. So there were things which really resonated, like the issue of Grenfell Tower. He's a London rapper. That message is going to resonate with his fans. But then, doing the whole Boris Johnson is racist thing, which at this point is just quite hackneyed because we've had endless debates about that. But then he mentioned Windrush and you think, oh, he's got a point there. But then he talked about Kate and Meghan Markle. And there was just too much. There was too much in there. And more importantly, never mind actually what he did, the more telling thing is that you then get these generous and continual rounds of applause from the kind of people, Labour MPs who, probably had to be briefed on who Dave is.
Yeah.
And so it just all feels a bit lame. And that sounds incredibly unforgiving and unsympathetic for what this 21-year-old did on stage. And I'm sure he meant it. But compare it to Strange Fruit by Nina Simone, which was saying something incredibly controversial and radical and impactful at the time. And it really meant something. Whereas now there's almost the pressure on, if rappers, and especially black rappers like Dave and Stormzy, don't put these kind of political messages in, then they're missing a trick, either with promotions or with the kind of woke discussion about music online who criticize people like that for not using their platform for good. So it just leaves you a bit cold.
Yeah, and, Stormzy did a similar thing at last year's Brits, and he, chanted "fuck the government, fuck Boris" at Glastonbury, and everyone was there to congratulate him. That's the thing. I mean, the laundry list of what Dave was talking about would not look out of place at any kind of Guardianista dinner party. And that's why you had people from The Guardian, from the Financial Times, praising him. Whereas there was once a time when rap or, various kind of new forms of music would have scandalized, the right-thinking people, whether that's because it's too sexual, too violent, too political even. But now it seems to be quite lame, quite stale, which is just a sad thing in general. I mean, last year's Brits was probably even more interesting in the fact that the 1975 literally read out a piece from a Guardian column. I mean, it doesn't get squarer than that, to be honest. That's not what I thought rock and roll was about. But anyway, Tim, your thoughts?
As you both say, it's not terrifically exciting to hear someone call Boris Johnson a racist for the 17th millionth time. It's just a widespread cliche. You've mentioned the various figures from the worlds of showbiz that have obviously accused Johnson of racism. I mean, I keep thinking of Gary Neville on Sky Sports on a Sunday afternoon. He quite happily called Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, a racist. And there didn't seem to be much outcry either in the studio or on Twitter. There was just constant cheering along. It is odd when you think about it. As Ella quite rightly pointed out, there's been a long history of, cultural figures sticking the boot into the political establishment. Cultural figures take anti-establishment lines, and that's fine. All power to them. But what's interesting at the moment, I think, is the extent to which a cultural figure having a pop at the leader of the country, it tells us something about the way in which the cultural establishment is almost opposed to, certainly the political leadership of the country. So what would make it more interesting, what would be more surprising, is if a cultural figure actually, stuck the boot into the cultural establishment for a change, actually says something that surprised the audience. I keep thinking of, great artistic protests from the past, various sort of 19th or sort of early 20th century avant-gardes, and they scandalized their own audiences. You think of sort of the Dada movement in sort of 1917 Zurich, and they shocked their kind of bourgeois patrons. Whereas what you have at the moment is you have artists, rappers with a certain sort of anti-establishment cachet. They're not scandalizing their audience at all. They're just preaching to the converted. That they are telling them what they want to hear. I would like to see a pop star or a comedian or an artist actually say something which went against the prevailing attitude and political sentiment which seems to dominate our cultural establishment right now.
Ella, anything to add?
I mean, the important thing is obviously questions about racism and talking about racism is important. And particularly for, someone like Dave, 21-year-old kid from Streatham, these issues are close to home. He also talked a lot about rehabilitation. He mentioned Jack Merritt. He himself has a brother who's in jail. All these things are personal to him, and it's not to say that he shouldn't talk about these things. But if we want to have serious conversations about racism, it's not that we shouldn't do them on the stage at the Brits, but it's that you have to interrogate what effect the continual crying wolf of racism against people like Boris Johnson is doing to more general discussions about racism, because there are, the hostile environment, for example, that the government spearheaded was in many ways a kind of racist policy. The treatment of Windrush was something that had deep implications for discussions about racism in this country. All of these things are very serious political issues, and we should talk about them openly instead of, elevating a young rapper to the position of almost a politician or a political figurehead, when actually these are much more complex issues.
You've been listening to the Spiked podcast. For more Spiked content, don't forget to keep visiting us at spiked-online.com, where you can also make a donation or treat yourself to something from our shop.